565 million euros. That's how much this country was making on its investments in 2025. Not per month, every single day. And here's the craziest part. They are strictly forbidden by law from spending a dime of it domestically. You're probably picturing oil-rich Arab sheikhs right now. Not even close. We're talking about a brutal, unforgiving land plunged into freezing darkness for half the year. A place where nature was so ruthless that ancient glaciers scraped away almost everything, leaving a pitiful 3% of arable land. The rest is just bare rock, violent storms, and permafrost. You'd think a place like this is just about bare-bones survival. Yet today, Norway stands as the wealthiest nation on Earth. In this episode, we're going to break down their sheer genius and staggering macroeconomic hypocrisy. You'll find out how a tiny country of just 5 million people managed to forge a $1.5 trillion financial weapon. We'll explain why even Wall Street is terrified of them, and how these tough northern guys cold-bloodedly bought up the planet while the rest of the world assumed they were just quietly fishing in the fjords. Before 1969, Norway was practically a different planet. Life on those rocks was so punishing that nearly 1 in 3 Norwegians packed up and fled to the US, chasing a better life. The only country with a higher emigration rate was Ireland, and that was because people there were literally starving to death. So what was left for those who stayed? Staring at the water. Thanks to those ancient glaciers, there was barely any fertile soil left. With only 3% of the land actually farmable, the rest was just barren rock and stone. Norwegians scraped by however they could, fishing, whaling, and even selling ice to the British. It sounds like a hustle from a shady TikTok guru, but it actually brought in some decent cash. Still, next to the industrial powerhouse of Sweden, they looked like the broke country cousins. And honestly, back then, Norwegians looked at the Swedes with the exact same desperate envy that today's economic migrants feel when they look at modern Norwegians. It felt like this nation of rugged fishermen was permanently stuck in the freezing backwaters of Europe. But everything flipped upside down in 1969. That's when, deep at the bottom of that very same sea, the Norwegians struck the ultimate historical jackpot. Picture 1969, the freezing North Sea, raging storms, and suddenly, the Norwegians strike oil. For Norway, it was an unimaginably massive reserve. But here's the paradox. By the standards of true oil empires, it wasn't actually anything mind-blowing. While Saudi Arabia, the USSR, and Venezuela were practically floating on endless oceans of black gold, Norway wasn't even close to breaking into the global top 10 for reserves. Which brings up a very logical question. How did a country with a relatively modest slice of the world's oil pie manage to build one of the wealthiest, most bulletproof economies on the planet, while so many other commodity giants crashed and burned? The answer lies in their absolute, cold-blooded financial audacity. While other countries were happily letting foreign megacorporations extract their resources for pennies, the Norwegians pulled a massive power move in 1972. They looked at the Americans and the French and said, "You want to drill our seabed? Be our guest. But you're giving us exactly half of every drop you pump." End of discussion. As a result, Norway was pocketing nearly 80% of the super profits, while over in the UK, sharing the exact same North Sea, the government was initially handing the lion's share to corporations just to get the pumps running faster. It wasn't just money that flooded the country. Norway was hit by a financial tsunami. And they were completely unprepared, immediately crashing into a textbook case of Dutch disease. The national currency shot to the moon, and suddenly Norwegian fish, ships, and everything else they used to make a living on became way too expensive for the global market. Traditional factories ground to a halt, people lost their jobs, and the government panicked, trying to drown the impending collapse in subsidies. But luckily, there were people in those government offices who knew how to look past the horizon. I guess the sailor's instinct to spot land through the fog beat out typical bureaucratic greed. They asked one very sobering question. Sure, right now we can patch any hole with oil money and live like kings without a care in the world. But what exactly is the plan for when this well runs dry? And right then, they proposed a solution that initially sounded like absolute madness. To save their own country, they had to get the money out of it immediately. The logic was ironclad. If you dump billions of petrodollars into a microscopic domestic market, it'll just incinerate the economy with hyperinflation. It's like strapping a rocket booster to a rotting wooden fishing boat. It's not going to fly. It's just going to rip apart from the G-force. So the Norwegian parliament made an unprecedented move. They took all their super profits, locked them inside a giant vault, and legally banned themselves from spending a single cent domestically. And that is how their legendary sovereign wealth fund was born. The ultimate weapon these guys from the icy rocks used to ruthlessly buy up the planet. For the first few years, this fund was unbelievably boring. The very first oil transfer dropped into the account in 1996, and the government decided to only invest in ultra-safe government bonds. Basically, they were just lending money to other countries for a tiny interest rate. It was safe, but there was one glaring problem. You don't get rich playing it safe. And that's when the Viking DNA finally kicked in. Let's be real, their ancestors didn't cross stormy, treacherous oceans in tiny wooden longboats just so their descendants could sit around thousands of years later, timidly clutching boring pieces of paper with a 2% yield. The bloodline demanded risk and scale. So in 1998, they took their next massive leap. They entered the global stock market. And they decided to buy absolutely everything. Today, the fund owns shares in nearly 9,000 companies. Apple, Microsoft, Tesla. The Norwegians are everywhere. They literally own 1.5% of every single publicly traded company on Earth. And this brings us to the golden rule that makes this whole system immortal. How much money do you think the government is allowed to withdraw from this megavault for its own needs? Half? 10%? Nope. By law, they can't touch more than 3% a year. Why exactly 3? Because that is exactly how much the fund makes in pure net profit from its investments. The Norwegian logic is brilliant in its ruthlessness. They only allow themselves to spend the interest, but the body of the fund, the actual oil billions, is strictly off limits. It's the ultimate goose that lays the golden eggs. Take the eggs, use them to build your flawless highways and luxury prisons, but under no circumstances do you slaughter the goose. That is exactly why, even when the very last drop of oil in the North Sea dries up, Norway will just keep living off the rest of the planet. But the Norwegians didn't stop at just sitting on a mountain of cash and clipping coupons. They realized something incredibly profound. Capital at this scale isn't just economics anymore. It's absolute power. And they weaponized their fund into a geopolitical heavy hitter. Think about it. Norway's population is just over 5 million. That's fewer people than you'll find in New York City. They have a modest military and exactly 0 nuclear warheads. With those base stats in the brutal arena of global politics, nobody is going to take you seriously. At best, you'll get a polite pat on the back at some summit on saving the seals. But when you have a $1.5 trillion vault standing behind you, the rules of the game change entirely. The Norwegians set up what they call the Council on Ethics. If a massive multinational corporation is polluting the ocean, manufacturing cigarettes, or using shady sweatshop labor in Asia, the fund doesn't just wag a finger at them. Norway publicly blacklists the company and aggressively dumps all of its stock on the open market. And when a heavyweight investor of that caliber loudly walks away from your business, it sends a massive signal to everyone else. These guys are toxic. Get out while you can. Your stock price instantly tanks, and your corporate reputation is ground to dust. And these aren't empty threats. Let's look at some real-world examples. Take Walmart, the colossal American retail empire and the largest supermarket chain in the world. At a certain point, the Norwegians didn't like how the corporation was handling labor union rights. The result? The fund cold-bloodedly booted them out of their portfolio, cutting off billions in investments. They aren't even afraid to dive headfirst into the spikiest geopolitical conflicts. One of the loudest scandals in recent years revolves around the Middle East. When Norwegian state funds found out that equipment from global industrial giants was being used to demolish homes in Palestinian territories in Gaza, and that Israeli corporations were building walls and surveillance systems there, you know what Oslo did? They ruthlessly dumped the shares of those companies on the street, without firing a single shot, without a single tank or aircraft carrier. A bunch of guys in wool sweaters gained the power to dictate terms to the biggest megacorporations on the planet. Forget about stocks, though. Real power is when a whole chunk of the world depends on you to not freeze to death this winter. Back in 2022, when Europe decided to pivot away from Russian gas, a massive, panic-inducing question hit the room. Who was going to replace it? And who stepped onto the stage in shining armor as the ultimate savior? Our quiet little Norway. Today, they pump over 30% of the EU's total gas supply and fuel a staggering 40% of Germany's industrial machine. The floor of the North Sea is tangled in thousands of miles of pipelines, tightly chaining an entire continent to tiny Oslo. But the absolute cherry on top is their sheer macroeconomic hypocrisy. Remember the golden rule of any drug lord? Never get high on your own supply. The Norwegians have elevated this to an absolute art form. Back home, they live in a pristine green utopia, powered by nearly 100% clean energy, buying up Teslas and obsessively sorting their recycling. And how do they pay for this eco-paradise? By ruthlessly flooding the rest of the globe with millions of barrels of fossil fuels, all while politely keeping Europe on a very short energy leash. And now the whole picture comes together. We're used to the idea that a superpower means nuclear missiles, massive armies, and loud politicians banging on podiums. But Norway simply hacked the matrix. They proved to the world that real, absolute power loves silence. A bunch of former fishermen hit the historical jackpot, and somehow became the only ones who didn't lose their minds from the crazy money. Instead of building gold-plated palaces, they locked their trillions in a vault, cold-bloodedly bought up a massive chunk of the planet, and put Europe on an energy leash. So behind that glossy postcard facade of cozy fjords and wool sweaters hides the smartest apex predator of the 21st century, a quiet empire that has already bought a tiny piece of your life while you weren't even looking. If you enjoy seeing complex geopolitics and economics broken down exactly like this, objective, fact-based, and with zero sugarcoating, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit that like button, let me know in the comments which country's economy we should dissect next, and I'll see you soon.